In fact, I can't ever remember getting together with the church family at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But I like it. This is great. I remember one time I was asked by a church in Port Florida to speak one evening, and I was grateful for the opportunity, got there, and boy, they had my name on a marquee, the whole 9 yards. Pete Frederick, come here, Pete Frederick, on Sunday night. And there were a few cars in the parking lot, maybe 10. But across the street at the Baptist church, on their marquee, it was, come here, the brother of Elvis Presley. And they had parking attendants to make sure everybody could find a place to park. And it occurred to me that we needed to change our marquee. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to chat with you and to continue our look at this wonderful book. If you have it, I'm going to be referring to it this afternoon. So if you would like to take your copy, that sounds sort of funny, doesn't it? Normally we're talking about the Bible, but your copy of John Bunyan, and if you want to mark it up and just highlight some things, that would be great. But we're glad you're here. Should be a fun afternoon. Tim is going to follow me after a short break when we're done. And then we have a meal planned this evening. And then after that, some fellowship time, and just going to be a great evening together. And then tomorrow, I think this was mentioned, but tomorrow service, 10:30, no Bible hour at 9, which many of us regret, but that's the way it is. And we'll pick that up next week. We've been talking about John Bunyan's book. We could probably call this an introduction to an overview of John Bunyan's book, The Pilgrim's Progress. And I confess, and they tell you in seminary, don't ever confess at the beginning of a message, but I have to confess, I have not read Pilgrim's Progress 100 times like Charles Spurgeon has. I'm sorry to say I haven't. Maybe I should have, and maybe I will, but to this point I haven't. I don't really have it on my table every morning either when I have my devotional time. It's not a book that, at least to this point, I have picked up often during the day or even during my quiet time to read, to review, and so forth. Again, maybe that's my loss. And it's also not my primary resource for sermon prep and for messages like you might hear on a Sunday morning. But having said that, Bunyan's own intro to the book that he gives here gives us a clue as to how the church has been benefited through the years by this wonderful book. He says, I, writing of the way and race of saints in our gospel day, fell suddenly into an allegory about their journey and the way to glory. Now, you've read that, and we know that that is the book. It's a picture. It's a picture of a life. His name is Christian. From beginning to end, from the moment he came to Christ until he reaches the celestial city. But in a way, I take it's John Bunyan's own story. It's a personal story about him. It depicts the life of the life that John Bunyan lived. It's the story, in fact, which we all live from beginning to end. Augustus Toplady wrote Rock of Ages. I think many of you love that song and know that he wrote it. But back in the 1700s, he said this about John Bunyan's book. The book, Pilgrim's Progress, describes every stage of a Christian's experience from conversion to glorification. I kind of look at this book as a map, sort of like a road map. I guess we know that not everybody has a well thought out philosophy. Not everybody has a very concise theology, but we all look at the world in a certain way. Philosophers call that our worldview, or if you will, everyone has a map. Everyone has a map, whether they know it or not, a worldview that they're following. And they're making decisions based on how that map is showing them the world. Their worldview answers a lot of the important questions. A biblical worldview answers those questions correctly. And but everyone has a worldview. It's not only their view of the world, but it's their view for the world. It's what gets them from this place to the next place, at least in their in their thinking. I sort of picture it like this sometimes. When I arrived in New York City to go to Radio City Music Hall to the Christmas event, I got off the train, had my map to show me how to get up to 51st Street, and then Bev brought out her map. And she showed me her map, and her map wasn't anything like my map. On my map, I had to walk some 10 blocks to get up to Radio City Music Hall. On her map, it was right across the block from Penn Station. And I'm thinking, where did you get that map? She says, I drew it. And I said, why did you? Well, look at the roads. For one thing, you've put them all alphabetically. They're not alphabetically lined up, and they're all going in the same direction. She was operating according to a map of her own design. And obviously that was not even going to get as close to Radio City Music Hall. Now, she didn't really do that. So don't go up to her later and say, can I see that map? Where did you get that? What were you thinking when you drew that map? But that's what people are doing. They're creating their own maps. Remember, and probably the kids know this better than I do, Lewis Carroll's Cheshire Cat in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And she's trying to make her way back to the looking glass, as you recall the story. And she runs into this cat, the Cheshire Cat. And she says, would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? And the cat says, well, that depends a good deal on where you want to go. And Alice's response to that was, well, I don't really much care where I am going. To which the cat responded, well, then it really doesn't matter which way you go. And for a lot of people in this world, that's exactly the way they're going. They have no real map. At least they have a map, but it's not tied to reality. And they're following that map and they're going nowhere. And ultimately, we know where the destination for those folks is. And by the way, we were all there once, were we not? And so I see John Bunyan's book here as a kind of a book that provides a big picture of the way to go from beginning to end. It's a great story. And it touches on just about everything that you and I would encounter in that journey, from the beginning to the end, to the celestial city that we'll hear about tomorrow. And I can't wait as Chris presents that to us. So my focus this morning, as Will has said, this afternoon, as Will has said, is Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair. If you've read the book, you know that Vanity is a city which Pilgrim travels to along with Faithful. But I'm going to pick up the story a little bit before Vanity Vanity Fair, if I can do that. Pick it up a little bit before that in what John Bunyan calls the Valley of the Shadow of Death. In Bunyan's book, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, and Pilgrim is alone at this point, is kind of like a wilderness experience for him. And it's a place in which Pilgrim, in a sense, just sort of loses his way. He loses a sense of the presence of God in this very dark and dank and foreboding place, the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Bunyan describes it on page 66. And so, like I said, I'll be referencing the book from time to time, but it's at the bottom of the page there. He says, now at the end of the valley was another valley called the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and Christian must needs go through it, because the way to the celestial city lay through the midst of it. Now this valley is a very solitary place. The prophet Jeremiah thus describes it: a wilderness, a land of deserts, desarts, whatever that is, probably not good, and of pits, a land of drought and of the shadow of death, a land that no man but a Christian passes through, and where no man dwelt. That's Bunyan's description of this place called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. And I would submit to you that all of us go through times just like that, wouldn't you say? I mean, I've been there, and to a lesser or greater degree, all of us have experienced something of that place where we just wonder about, where is God? And sometimes that's even our heart cry: oh God, show me your grace, show me your person, show me your face. The psalmist read the Psalms, you can't help but see many laments like that. And often there's the question, where is he? Of course, in the Psalms, so many of those men then turn to the truth and find it was not God's problem. It was me. But we all need to be reminded of the fact that just like Christian went through this place, so we too go through places like that. Sometimes I've heard people refer to that place as the dark night of the soul. Certain things in life can trigger it. And sometimes it's a short, brief period. Sometimes it's a lengthy period. In some cases, there are people, even men and women of faith, who struggle with this all of their lives, always going back by faith to the one who is the light. How often in those times, the way just seems beyond us. We kind of lose our way. And that's exactly what happened to Christian in this place. But Bunyan, in his book, provides some really wonderful insights for those of you or us, or for Pilgrim as he's transversing that place. And one of the things he said that really, really helped Christian was the presence of another. The presence of another. Bunyan on page 70 tells us about Christian, that when he had traveled in this disconsolate condition some considerable time, he thought he heard the voice of a man as going before him, saying, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear none ill, for thou art with me." And Bunyan says, then Christian was glad. And for these reasons, number one, because he gathered from the voice that he heard that some who feared God were in the valley also with him, in the darkness with him. Secondly, he rejoiced, he was glad, for he perceived God was with him, though in the dark and dismal state. And why not, thought he, with me, though by reason the impediment that attends this place, I cannot perceive it. And then the third reason why he was glad, he says, for he hoped, Bunyan says, for he hoped he could overtake the one that had spoken into the darkness. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear none ill, for thou art with me. Bunyan doesn't tell us who that person is, but in a very brief time, he's going to catch up with a man. And the man's name is Faithful. I take it, I could be wrong, but I take it that Faithful was the man who spoke in the darkness, and that was the voice that Bunyan heard. Bunyan on page 74 speaks of the reunion, or the time when he finally does meet up with Faithful. On page 74, it reads like this: "Now, as Christian went on his way, he came to a little ascent, which was cast up on purpose, that pilgrims might see them, or see before them. Up there, therefore, the Christian went, and looking forward, he saw Faithful before him upon his journey." And then drop down a little bit. At this, Christian was somewhat moved, and putting all his strength, he quickly got up with Faithful and did also overrun him. And so Christian sees him and begins to run towards him. Another soul in the darkness, and he catches up to him. Then did Christian vaingloriously, humorously said, smile, because he had gotten the start of his brother. I guess he was quicker or more faster than Faithful and catching up, but that was short-lived because he fell, he tripped, he fell and stumbled and could not rise up. I don't know why, but he could not get up, and Faithful comes up and helps him. And Bunyan says, "Then I saw in my dream they went very lovingly on together, had sweet discourse of all things that had happened to them in their pilgrimage. And thus Christian began, my honored and well-beloved brother Faithful, I am glad that I have overtaken you, and that God has so tempered our spirits that we can walk as companions in this pleasant path, a pleasant path, not because the path itself was pleasant, but because now it becomes pleasant with the company of a close friend." Just as an aside, there's a little pamphlet out there written by Edward Welch, and the pamphlet is titled "Depression, the Way Up When You Are Down." It's interesting in there, Welch reports that after having talked to a number of people who had gone through such darkness and had come out into the light, and it was sort of like a survey, a questionnaire put to them, and the question was, what helped bring you from the light or from the darkness into the light? What was that really helped you the most? And there were a lot of things that people mentioned, but these caught my eye. One said, "A friend let me borrow her faith. Mine was so weak." Another said, "My friend didn't give up on me. She was always putting me or pointing me to the truth." Another comment was, "I had a friend who kept the bigger picture of God's kingdom in front of me. My world was very small. My world was very small. When I saw that God was on the move, I began to take hope." Many of us are familiar with the passage in Hebrews. And although Bunyan doesn't allude to it, it certainly comes to my mind as I think about the necessity of mutual camaraderie in the Church of Jesus Christ. He has provided for us a wonderful resource in that person sitting next to you or across the aisle from you. A wonderful resource, a Christian who is there alongside. And hence, the writer of Hebrews says to those of us who are in Christ, let us consider, you know the verse, right? Hebrews 10, 24, 25. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Give it much thought. Consider. It's the same word that's used in chapter 3, verse 1. Consider Jesus Christ. That's not a casual look that the writer is calling us to. That's a deep, consistent, involved, comprehensive look at Christ. And in the same way, the writer calls us to consider one another. Consider one another. My prayer is that God would help me do just that. I think when we're called to love one another as Christ loved the church, that certainly there's so much more that we can learn. And may we look to the Spirit of God to help us. But it's give much thought to what? Well, the writer goes on, how to stir up one another to love and to good works. Consider how to love, to kind of, if you will, agitate people, to stir people, to move people to love and good works. And in all the different ways that we do that. MacArthur in his book has a list, and you've probably seen that, his theology book I'm talking about, has a list of the 21 another principles there that speak to how we are as the Church of Jesus Christ, as pilgrims, if you will, along this path to the celestial city, are to encourage one another. And so we find that Christian is encouraged by the presence of this brother that he joins up with, and will ultimately go into the city called Vanity with. The two of them will enter together. The other thing that helped Christian, and in this time was, Will mentioned evangelists last night and the important ministry that evangelists had in the life of Christian, especially as he was starting out. But evangelist shows up from time to time in the story. I think Will also mentioned the second time when evangelist came alongside Christian, who had gotten off the path, and he moved him back onto the path. He showed them the path, and he said, you need to not be led astray by false voices. And the one voice that he mentioned was Mr. Worldly Wise Man, who had told Christian to seek deliverance from his heavy burden through law. But guess what? It's also evangelist now who shows up in the darkness, in the valley of the shadow of death. And so there's Faithful, who's come alongside and has provided great encouragement for Christian. And then there's this, I guess you would call him a practitioner of the faith. Maybe it was a reference to Bunyan's pastor at the time, or maybe a real live counselor in the life of John Bunyan, or helper or friend or Christian brother. But in any case, he shows up in the story, and he comes alongside the two of them, Faithful and Christian, and he begins to counsel them, speak to them. Tim gave me a book to look at by Wayne Mack. The title of that is Christian life issues. It's based on John Bunyan's book. I would highly recommend you get that book and have it in your library. And in the future, as you go through John Bunyan, you might keep it handy. He gives some interesting insights. You know, Wayne Mack, he's kind of the preeminent biblical counselor and written many books on biblical counseling. But one of the things that he says with regard to this man, evangelist, he talks about how he is actually doing biblical counseling with these two men, with Faithful and Christian. And he talks about how he comes alongside them. Evangelist comes alongside them. And you can read this. I'm not going to read it, but it's on pages 97 and 98. And he has questions for them. And he's a very careful listener. And then he counsels and he provides wisdom and he instructs and even gives some warning. I will read that on page 98. So again, evangelist in the darkness or towards the end of this darkness comes and provides a voice of sanity for them, a helpful voice, an instructive voice, a concerned voice. My sons, he says, you have heard in the words of the truth of the gospel that you must through many tribulations enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again, that in every city bonds and afflictions abide in you, and therefore you cannot expect that you should long go on your pilgrimage without them in some sort or another. Again, this is evangelist talking to Christian and Faithful as they're about to enter into the city called Vanity. You have found some things of truth in these testimonies upon you already, and more will immediately follow. For now, as you see, you are almost out of the wilderness, and therefore you will soon come into a town that you will by and by see before you. And in that town you will be hardly beset with enemies who will strain hard, but they will kill you. And be you sure that one or both of you must seal the testimony which you hold with blood. But be you faithful unto death, and the king will give you a crown of life. He that shall die there, although his death will be unnatural, and his pains perhaps great, he will yet have the better of his fellow, not only because he will be arrived at the celestial city sooner, but because he will escape many miseries that the other will meet within the rest of his journey. And so they arrive at Vanity. Bunyan says this, then I saw in my dream that when they got out of the wilderness, they presently saw a town before them. And the name of that town, Vanity. And at that town, there is a fair kept called Vanity Fair. It is kept year long. It bears the name of Vanity Fair because the town where it is kept is lighter than vanity, and also because all that is there is sold, or that is sold is vanity. And if you want to make a note of that, it was on page 99 where Bunyan makes that comment. 6 things about this city that Bunyan provides for us in his book. Number 1, many of the places that that Christian visits, he either visits them because he shouldn't have, or sometimes it was the case that when he did visit it, that's what I was saying, he shouldn't have visited, or going to other places where he knew he should not go to. But this is a city, and this is the first thing I want to say about Vanity, and Bunyan points this out. It's a city, it's no choice. You don't have a choice. We all, Bunyan, Faithful, Christian, we all must go through that city. Bunyan says this, now, as I said, the way to the celestial city lies just beyond this town. And he that will go up to the city and yet not go through this town must needs go out of the world. So whatever this town is, whatever it represents, Bunyan understands it to be a place that all of us who are in Christ must visit, indeed are even now visiting. Secondly, it was a place that unless you knew better, as it's described in John Bunyan's book, unless you knew better, you might look at it as a place to go on holiday. Say, what? And the reason for that is because the place itself was extremely alluring, very attractive. It has something to suit everybody's pleasure. In fact, it has something to offer everyone's vice. Bunyan makes a comment about some of the things that were sold in that city, which when I first kind of read that, I didn't quite understand perhaps what he was trying to communicate. And incidentally, there's a lot of things even so that I don't quite understand how to interpret and so forth, but that's okay. Enjoy the story and follow the journey. But in any case, he mentions that in this city, there are wares, there's merchandise that's being sold. And he says this, merchandise representing different countries and nations. There were in Bunyan's Vanity Fair something for everyone, no matter one's language, ethnic background, or country. That's my comment. In other words, Bunyan talks about items from every country in the world to suit the fancy of people who are in this town. And I guess what's being communicated there is that this city and the things that it offers to people on earth, this city, which, as we will see, represents the world, not people, not the creation, but the world system under the oversight of Satan, contrary to God. This city called Vanity offers to all men things to entice them, to allure them, to move them away from the truth and from God himself. And even Satan is so clever to design particular, if you will, merchandise for whatever country you may live in, whatever ethnic background you're from, whatever may be your philosophy, whatever may be your thinking. It's all there for you to grasp and to take in the place of God. This is the merchandise that's for sale in Vanity. So it's a place that Christian had to go through. It was a place that, unless you knew better, like I said, and we do know better, it wasn't a place for holiday for sure. It's not something to be taken casually. And it's not a fun place in and of itself by definition, because it is under the sway of Satan himself. Hence, third thing, it was a dangerous place. Two people, faithful Christian, went into the city. One person came out, Christian. And we'll talk in a moment about what happened to faithful. But it was a dangerous city. Not only that, but Bunyan in his book tells us who found the city. Apollyon, Revelation 9, a reference to Satan. Beelzebub, Mark chapter 3:22, another reference to Satan. And then he also mentions Legion, which in a passage, I think it's Mark, I can't remember Mark something, but he talks about a man who is possessed by many demons. And so what we see is Vanity is a place in Bunyan's mind that was founded by Satan and his demons. And as Bunyan tells his readers, the fair is no new erected business, but a thing of ancient standing, almost 5,000 years agone. It's been around a while. This is no new city. This is the city of the world. Vanity, it's the world system. Fourthly, another thing about Vanity, just its name itself, of course, tells you something about it. And when we hear the word vanity, of course, what book of the Bible do you think about? Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And we go to Solomon for insight there, but Solomon tells us, I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, doesn't matter what I've seen. Everything under the sun, everything on this earth, if you will, everything apart from God is vanity, empty, useless. Why would I ever invest in something like that? And it's just such a place to which faithful and Christian go. Again, Mack is helpful here. He says this about the place. Vanity is the city of destruction at its most central and alluring party line. Now think, when you hear that, vanity, think the world in which I live. Think New Bern. Think North Carolina. Think the world system. This is where we live, folks. We live in a world. And we're told that for a certain time, and to a certain degree, the prince of the power of the air has his way. But ultimately, of course, God is overseeing it all. But this is the world in which we live. It's a dangerous world. You know that. I think most of you understand that. We understand that. And so Matt goes on, it's a never-ending party full of meaningless pleasures designed to distract and preoccupy. Vanity Fair represents the emptiness of life without God. It is a microcosm of the sinful world and its alluring temptations. Vanity represents the world system under Satan's control in which we as Christians live. It represents the pleasures the world has to offer, pleasures that don't really provide lasting satisfaction, but are meaningless and worthless from an eternal perspective. Another thing about the city is this, that in the city, I've already alluded to the merchandise that Bunyan tells us about that's sold in this city, but he gets a little bit more specific, a little more detail on page 100 as he begins to identify the merchandise. Okay, here you go. It includes houses, lands, trades, places, honors, titles, countries, kingdoms, lusts, pleasures, and delights of all sorts, as whores, prostitutes, bawds, bawds, wives, husbands, children, masters, servants, gold, silver, pearls, precious stones, and whatnot. This is the merchandise of the world system, if you will, of vanity, the world in which we find ourselves even now. And what's interesting to me is that in that list, there are good things and bad things. And the bad things I understand. I mean, Peter, in the first epistle, chapter 2, talks about these lusts for things that wage war against the soul, and that he warns us against those things. But what about the good things? How do they become a problem for you and me? And I think most of us understand the answer to that question. The other day in my Bible class at school, I often, when I'm reading my Bible in the morning, will come up with something that I will then pose to the class, just a kind of a icebreaker, if you will, as we start the Bible class each day, high school class. And on this particular day, I was reading where Jesus said, and I'm not going to quote this just right, but he warned his disciples about loves, and said something to the effect that he who loves his father, his mother, his brothers, his sister, his wives, and on he went, more than me, is not fit to be my disciple. What? Other places talk about how we are to hate these. And I posed that to the class, and I said, what on earth does this mean? That we are not to love our moms, our dads, our brothers, and our sisters, and so forth, or if you will, hate them. And one of the kids was astute enough to observe, not that we hate these people, but that our love for the Lord Jesus Christ far excels that love for anything else in the world. And I think what Bunyan is helping us see, that even good things, if we love them beyond our love for God, if they take the place of God, then they become an idol in our lives and a hindrance and a detriment to that which God is seeking to accomplish in and through us. Be careful, Christian, about that. And that was the warning to Christian with regard to some of the things, the wares of this city. Of course, the evil things that Bunyan talks about are worthless vanity. Good night. What are we doing chasing after those things? And there's just so much that Satan can use in this world to distract us from that all-important pursuit of the holy. Agreed? And we know that. But we need to be aware of that, constantly aware of that. And again, the counsel of a faithful friend, the counsel of a counselor who knows his word, who knows the scripture and can come alongside us and help us when we're looking poorly or wrongly at the things of this earth. Another thing that we find about this city, and this is the last thing that I'm going to mention about Vanity. The people there in Vanity, now get this, they didn't like initially, they didn't like ultimately Christian and faithful. They're always glad to have strangers come into their town. But eventually, Christian and faithful began to rub the town in the wrong way. Began to rub the town in the wrong way. And Bunyan tells us that they created a hubbub. That's not a word I use every day in my vocabulary. In fact, I had to kind of look it up. What is a hubbub? I think I can guess, but I wanted to be careful. What is a hubbub? And on page 102 of Bunyan's book, they began to stir the pot. They began to stir the pot. And they created a hubbub, which I came to find out was a chaotic din. That's what my dictionary told me, a chaotic din. Did you get that? Make it in your notes, a chaotic din. And then I had to ask, what's a din? And so I had to look that one up. Kept me busy for a while. Loud, unpleasant, prolonged noise. So let's pretend we're going to make a hubbub here, okay? Can you help me here do that? No, we're not going to do that. But you can imagine what it would be like. In walks Will, contramundo, and all of a sudden he just stirs the pot by virtue of the fact he's a man of the truth, and he's there to tell it the way it is, and begins to kind of rile people, and the hair on their neck begins to rise, and all of a sudden you have this hubbub. And Christian tells us that the hubbub was for a number of reasons. Number one, it was because of the clothes they wore. Huh? The clothes they wore. Well, I think, can see the analogy there. The garments of the Christian do have an effect on the world around us, and they're not always taken as a means of blessing to the world. Bunyan tells us that their speech, we can understand that, their speech created a hubbub. The way they were talking, the things about which they were talking about were not well received, hence the hubbub. And then thirdly, there's this. This was the clincher. But that which did not a little amuse the merchandisers was that these pilgrims set very light by all their wares. They weren't partaking in the business of the city. They cared not so much as to look upon them. And if they called upon them to buy, they would put their fingers in their ears and cry, "Turn away mine eyes from beholding vanity." Now, there's an exercise I think we all ought to practice. Put your fingers in your ears, maybe put your hands over your eyes and cry, "Oh, eyes, oh, hands, turn away from beholding emptiness. Let me grab hold of those things of substance." Like Abraham, who looked for a city whose builder, maker were God. Next paragraph. One chanced mockingly beholding the carriages of the men, faithful and Christian, to say to them, "What will you buy?" I love this. But they, looking gravely upon him, said, "We buy the truth. We buy the truth." A long time ago, I heard that phrase in a message that somebody was preaching, and I wondered, what does that mean? We buy the truth. They were looking at a passage in Proverbs. Solomon said, "Buy the truth and do not sell it." You ever run across that passage? Buy the truth and don't sell it. Proverbs 23:23. I take it that what the writer of Proverbs there is saying, get the truth at all costs. Make whatever sacrifice you need to be a man or woman of the truth. And then the writer went on to say, and do not sell it. Don't give it up for any price. by the truth. And at that there was an occasion taken to despise the men the more, some mocking, some taunting, some speaking reproachfully, and some calling upon others to smite them. And some of you have heard my little story that Bev and I had to face one time. And this idea that the world is contrary to the truth just kind of hit us like a ton of bricks on an occasion about 25, 30 years ago. And some of you have heard this story, but when our son was in high school, a public high school in Port Charlotte, Florida, he was given the opportunity to speak at commencement. He was the valedictorian of this high school, public high school. And rightfully so, they required all of their speakers to submit a speech that they were going to give, the speech they were going to give, so they could look it over and just make sure everything's okay. The day before he graduated, I got a call from him. This was Friday. He was going to graduate on Saturday. I got a call from him, and he said, "Dad, they're not going to let me graduate." I thought he was kidding. So I quickly called a history prof of his who I happened to know was a believer and had some relationship with. And I asked him, did he know anything about what was going on here? And could he inform me? He said, "I have no clue what you're talking about." He said, I'll get back to you. And within an hour, he called back. He said, "Yeah, I got a copy of the speech. I took the speech to the faculty lunchroom, read it to all the faculty members, and not everybody agreed. Very few did agree, but nobody saw a problem with the speech that he couldn't give it. And so I called the principal, caught her just as she was leaving for rehearsal that Friday evening or Friday afternoon. She said, "Well, meet me at 5 at my office and we'll talk about that." And I did. So there was the principal, there was I was sitting across from her, and I said, "Okay, what's going on here with my son's speech?" She opened her drawer, took out a piece of paper, came, sat right by me. She had a copy of the speech. It was all marked up in red, sat right by me and said, "This," she actually pointed to the speech. She said, "This is offensive." And I looked at what my son had written, and it was basically a suggestion, if you will, a counsel to his fellow classmates, all 300 of them, that they consider, although they were of many different philosophies, many different ideas and so forth, but they might consider in their journey, seek the truth, the truth. And she said, "That is offensive." And I said, "Excuse me? Why is that offensive?" Well, she went into great detail, and I began to see, I think for the first time in my life, just how contrary the world is to God's truth. She said he needs to change it. I said, what if he doesn't change it? This is a true story. She said, "I may not let him graduate." 4 years, Port Charlotte High School. She may not let him graduate. I said, "I'll talk to him, but I don't think he's going to change his mind." I did talk to him, didn't change his mind, called her back and said, "He's not changing his mind." Click. 4 hours later, now it's about 9 o'clock at night, she calls me and says, "Well, we're going to let him graduate." Click. I guess she wasn't dumb. I mean, that would only go so far, I guess, to not let a kid graduate because of a speech you were going to censor. And but my point is, same thing, created a hubbub. And I don't know how the word got out, but there were a lot of students who got wind of that, and they were crying foul. And there were a couple of teachers themselves who, when they heard about that, were likewise crying foul. It created a hubbub in that particular situation. Same thing here. It was the truth, God's truth, God's eternal truth, that created the stir. And I would submit to you, it's the same today. It's exactly the same today. And I wish we had detail. My little talk today is not about the world system and about all that is there for us to see and understand and how to fight that and how to live in that and so forth. But it's there. It's vanity. We live in vanity. Hence, my little portion here I've entitled it "Walking in Truth, Despising the Attractions of Vanity." We need to move. Help me move. The rest of the story. Okay, let me just summarize the rest of the story. Ultimately, both were arrested for their disdain for the wares and the business of this city. They were beaten. And now we're talking about faithful, smeared with dirt, falsely accused, put into a cage that they might be, as Bunyan says, made a spectacle to all the men at the fair. Great. Faithful then was put on trial. 3 witnesses. They were envy, superstition, Pinkthank. Get the accusations here. Envy. I heard him once myself affirm that Christianity and the customs of our town of Vanity were diametrically opposite and could not be reconciled. Boy, right on. He heard him right. That's offensive? Yes, sir. Superstition. I heard him say that our religion was naught, and such by which a man could by no means please God. And you know, your lordship, and he then addresses the judge, whose name was Hate Good. You can imagine where this trial is going to go. And what necessarily thence will follow, to wit, that we worship in vain and yet are in our sins and are finally to be damned. Yeah, he heard that right. Pinkthank said he has spoken contemptuously of Lord Beelzebub's. Honorable friends, Lord Old Man, Lord Carnal Delight, Lord Desire of Vain Glory, and Lord Lechery, and all the rest of our nobility. Yeah, heard that right. No wonder there was a hubbub. These folks were unhappy with the truth. Faithful was found guilty, and Bunyan tells us about his demise on page 110. It's not lengthy. Let me just read it for you. They therefore brought him out to do with him according to their law. First they scourged him, then they buffeted him, then they lanced his flesh with knives. After that they stoned him with stones, then pricked him with their swords, and last of all they burned him to ashes at the stake. Thus came Faithful to his end. That's on page 110 at the bottom of the page there. Although Bunyan adds this little footnote. Now I saw, Bunyan speaking here, that there stood behind the multitude a chariot and a couple of horses waiting for Faithful, who, as soon as his adversaries had dispatched him, was taken up into it, and straightway was carried up through the clouds with sound of trumpet, the nearest way to the celestial gate. But as for Christian, he had some respite and was remanded back to prison, although very shortly after that he is released, no details given, and he's on his way. That is their experience in Vanity. Just a couple of things, and then we're done here. A couple of observations, really, more than anything, or you might even call them lessons. I had a number of them, but for the sake of to be brief and to allow us time to take a rest here before the next message that Tim's going to bring us, and I'm looking with great anticipation to that message. Persecution. We could have spent some time talking about that aspect of vanity, and it's real. It was real for these men. Jesus said, well, you know the Sermon on the Mount. Have you read the Beatitudes lately? The Beatitudes are talking about what a Christian life looks like and how blessed is the man who is living in this way and is exhibiting these traits and is showing the character of God in his life in this way. That man is truly blessed. The Beatitudes, one after another. Jesus is speaking to the crowds and specifically to his disciples about what it is to be a true Christian. He comes to the end of that discussion in Matthew, and you then, with all of these Beatitudes, you have this last one, and it reads like this: blessed are those, you know what I'm going to say, you know what he said because you know the Beatitudes. Blessed are those, okay, he's been talking about Christian character and the blessedness of living for Christ, and then he says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice. Only commands in the Beatitudes. Rejoice. Be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And so persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus understood and tried to help his disciples understand something very hard, perhaps hard to take, maybe not easily understood, but it's this. Jesus himself was a man who was persecuted. You know that. They persecuted me because the world hates me. Jesus said, if the world hates you, know that it first hated me. He told the disciples that in John chapter 15, verse 18. If you were of the world, if you were of vanity, the world would love its own. They would love you. Yet because you are not in the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember, the servant is not greater than his master if they be persecuted. And so, again, we all know something of the hatred of the world for the things of Christ. We've all experienced that to some degree, I'm sure. All of us can give testimony to ways we've seen that manifested. We've heard of the great persecutions that believers around the world are going through, and praise God, it's not that bad here yet for us, and we're happy for that, and we rejoice over that, but we know that there are many in this world who claim the name of Christ who are suffering terribly for the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. As to what we in America will experience in the future, I have no idea. I'm a little bit older than Kinsey, so I'll probably go first. She'll still be around when I'm gone. She won't even remember me, but that's okay. But my point is, maybe some of our young ones here are going to have to face things that we even maybe in my generation 20, 30 years ago couldn't even imagine might be true. People going to jail because of the things we say that are contra the mundo, against the world and the world system. It doesn't sit well when we say those things. You're being very narrow. You're being very hateful. In fact, laws are being written around the world to subdue the voices that speak the truth. And we know of those stories. I don't know what's going to happen in the future here. It's the great unknown. Good news is, no matter what happens, blessed are you, Christian, when we, like our Lord Jesus Christ, experience the same rebuke, persecution, and to follow in that train, and that is to incur the hatred of men, is to allow us then at that point, like Jesus says in the Beatitudes, when that happens, what's the command? The one command in the Beatitudes is what? When they persecute you, when you are hated by all men, when you find yourself being, if you will, confronted by the world system, in that moment, do what? Rejoice. Rejoice. And be exceeding glad. Wow. You need to help me with that one. But that was God's mandate for us. And by the way, to not be rejoicing in that moment and exceeding glad at the opportunity we have to stand for the truth, to represent Christ, to be his in the midst of such trial, is sin. Let us be careful in that moment to rejoice, which, by the way, in every little death that we face, every little trial, every one of them, let us be rejoicing and be exceedingly glad as we suffer, if it's for the name of Christ and for his sake. It's not the end of the story. There's a little bit more for my part, and it's this. This is a great ending to the story. I'm going to read what Bunyan had to say, because he lost a friend. I can't even imagine what that would be. Went through the valley of the shadow of death with him, spent some time in Vanity, confronting the world system, watching his friend then be beat up, killed. I can't imagine what that would be like. But Faithful's taken to heaven, and Bunyan is now continuing his journey. I'm sorry, Christian is now continuing his journey. And Bunyan says this, "Now I saw in my dream that Christian went forth both alone. He went forth not alone, for there was one whose name was," introduce, "hopeful, being made so by the beholding Christian and faithful in their words and behavior, in their sufferings at the fair." Here's a man who was there. Here's a man who was watching. Here's a man who, although Christian and faithful, didn't know him, I guess, but was observing how they were standing for the truth, observing their behavior, observing their clothes, observing their speech. And because of that, once Christian was out of town, what does he do? He rushes to catch up with him. He joined himself unto them, and entering into a brotherly covenant, told them that he would be his companion. Thus, one died to make testimony to the truth, and another rises out of the ashes to be a companion with Christian in his pilgrimage. This hopeful also told Christian that there were many others. There were many more of the men like himself in the fair who would take their time, but eventually would follow. That's also good news, to know that we're not alone and to know that we can have an impact. It's funny in the Beatitudes, not funny, but it's interesting that in the Beatitudes, what's the very next thing that Jesus says? You and you alone are the salt of the earth. You and you alone are the light of the world. And so we go forth with that knowledge and realizing that not only is it the greatest way we have to be able to glorify our wonderful and great God, but at the same time, people are watching. And it's going to provide for us a great opportunity to witness to the truth so that men would see and believe. Father, thank